Hello, it's Matt McLachlan. Before we get to this week's podcast, I wanted to extend a very special invitation to you. In August 2025, my signature tour is heading back to the Western Front, and I'd love you to come with me. We're going to explore the battlefields of France and Belgium and tell the entire story of the Australians during the First World War. It's going to be an amazing trip. We're going to visit the Somme, we're going to visit the Ypres Salient, French Flanders, famous battlefields such as Passchendaele, Pozières, Villers-Bretonneux, Bullecourt, Fromelles, and many more. Now, this is the only tour I'm going to personally escort to the Western Front in 2025. So if you'd like to come with me, please don't wait. The tour sells out very, very quickly. It departs Paris on the 30th of August, 2025, and you can find full information at our website, which is battlefields.com.au.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds.
Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month.
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
A Living History production.
This is the Living History Podcast, broadcasting live across the airwaves.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Living History and the fourth and final in our very special series about the closing days of the First World War. It's been a pretty exciting ride, and like all these things when we do these special series, I come into them thinking that I know just about everything there is to know on the topic, and then I learn a heap as we go along, and that's certainly been the case in this one, and that's thanks mostly to my co-host, Mr. Peter Hart. Pete, welcome back.
Hi, Matt. I'm not so sure about that, but we've learned together, I think.
We've worked together, mate. No, I get you on just for giggles and just because you know good quotes, but you also know a damn lot about history as well, it turns out. So they're always fantastic. I love doing these special series, so we'll do many more. They're time-consuming and they're tiring, but we get through them. We're always very proud that we've done a good job, and I think this one's no exception. It's been a good journey, hasn't it? It
has. I've really enjoyed it, and I look forward to the next series if we do it. It'd be good. Onwards, ever onwards.
Ever onwards. Well, that dovetails well with what we're talking about today. Fourth episode, On to Victory against the Germans. This one's really a sort of an all-encompassing just discussion about how the war came to an end. Because if we talk about the final months of 1918 as a bit of an overlooked chapter, the final weeks are a really overlooked chapter. I know everyone talks about Armistice Day itself and all the dramas about the 11th of November, and we're going to talk about that as well. But some absolutely bitter fighting in the lead-up to those final days of the war, and it must have been just horrific. We're going to dig into it in detail to talk about how horrific it was, but Christ, I can't imagine what it was like for those poor blokes, knowing that the war was coming to an end.
Absolutely. And the thing is that a lot of books you read, and including my 1918, A Very British Victory, the combination of author fatigue and publishers saying you can't have another. But those battles, the Battle of the Somme, 4th of November, is a huge battle. It's on a Somme style, Somme scale. And yet, no, if you went on the street, no one would know about the battle. No one would know anything about it. So this is a chance for us to pay tribute to those lads who fought in those terrible last battles. They were just awful.
And the structure of this episode is slightly different again because we're not going to go into so much sort of tactic and the overarching plan. We're going to talk just about battles, and we're going to talk about what it was like for the men who were in them, because that's really what it's all about. By this stage of the war, there wasn't some incredible overarching strategic left hook that was going to change the course of the war. It was just about battering the Germans day in and day out. And so let's kick off with that, because that's the first big point to make, isn't it, is that it was unrelenting.
It's absolutely unrelenting. There's no lull in the fighting. There's no calm for, months where everyone can sort of recharge the batteries. There's no time for units to restock their ranks. And we discussed in the last episode how the Australian Corps was ground down almost to nothing. There's no chance for anything. It just never stops.
And that's a point we should make for our Aussie listeners. Last week we talked all about the Australians. In direct contradiction to that, this week there's going to be no Australian content, pretty much because the Aussies are not in the line anymore. The Aussies are so exhausted and so, destroyed, and so numbers so reduced that they've been removed. And so by the time we rejoin this for the last 6 weeks or so of the war, there's very limited Australian involvement.
I'm afraid so. But they'd done their part. They'd more than done their part, as we both paid tribute to last time. For the actual, think of what it must be like to be actually caught up in this. It's like a never-ending cycle, and a lot of people were looking forward to a Blighty wound. This old idea of a Blighty wound, and this is Gunner Jack Roby of Sea Battery 231 Brigade Royal Field Artillery, and he said this: "The one large dugout was occupied by the officers. We servants were in a bit of a shelter in a ditch covered only by sheets of corrugated iron. The guns were in the open. Shellfire was almost continuous. I must have dropped off and was awakened by a shell that dropped just in front of our shelter. I felt something hit my foot, and did it sting! I jumped up, coughing. It was a gas shell, killing the sentry who was on guard outside. My first thoughts were to dash into the officer's dugout. Major Campbell found that I'd been hit in the stomach, also in the leg and foot. When the stretcher arrived and I was being carried away, Major Campbell came to me and said, 'You are a lucky lad. I wish it was me. Best of luck.'" And that's the old Blighty wound thing. And Roby was...
Isn't that the balance of a Blighty wound, isn't it? You want to get wounded enough that they've got to send you away from the fighting, but not so much that it kills you. It's a fine balance, and sadly you don't have much control.
Or gives you a wound that you'll never really recover from, minus a leg or something, So we've been through the rapid progress. But the war's been battering on. But they could see the Germans are falling back, and there's just a glimmering of hope in some people's minds. It can't go on for long. We keep advancing. It surely it's going to come to an end. But the one question is, and this would be, can you imagine? Oh, well, I can't imagine us being soldiers, or certainly not me. I'm too cowardly. But they must have thought, you can't help. You've played your part, but are you going to live? Are you going to live to see the end of the war, or are you going to be another statistic?
Well, it's not a philosophical question, is it, either? Because they're taking part in these attacks every day, and they're seeing their mates still getting their heads blown off all around them. So, I mean, they're seeing it with their own eyes that not everyone is going to make it. They're watching people die every day, and it must have been, what a weight on their mind.
Yeah, the temptation to take things a bit easy, the temptation just to reduce the risks in action. But of course that means you're less effective as a soldier. So there's this balance going on. And you've got a quote from Sergeant Charles Templar of 13th Gloucesters. What's he say?
So he's on leave, and he says, "While I was over on that leave, my mother told me that my uncle, her brother, who was my godfather, was in hospital with cancer and very ill. So I went to see him. I walked in there to his room, and the first thing he said to me was, 'Charles, don't get yourself killed now. The war won't last much longer. The country will need young men like you.'"
And that's what's going through a lot of people's heads. But there's still
it's
October...
bad enough you're thinking it, but then you're getting it reinforced from your relatives at home. Yeah. Make sure you come home, son. It's nearly over. We'll see you at Christmas.
But there's plenty of fighting left for them. I mean, just 6 weeks or 5 weeks to go. 5 weeks is some of the most murderous mayhem you can imagine. And in October, the fight, it just rages up and down the Western Front. The Germans slightly shift their tactics. They're now much more reliant on like Monash, mechanical battle. They're reliant on machine guns and artillery to stop them. And they don't really have time to build defensive works, but they're desperately trying to set up new lines. 8th of October, British 3rd and 4th Armies, the French 1st Army launch a new offensive, and they're trying to take Cambrai. It's all part of the continuation of the 4 battles in 4 days, and it's all going on. And I think that's a successful assault. I don't know what you think. It's pretty good, isn't it?
It wasn't, it wasn't a big smash like we've seen on 8th of August, but still pretty effective. I think that they break through the German lines. They advance about 5,000 yards. It's a good effort. They're pushing the Germans back. And Cambrai is threatened by the Royal Naval Division.
Hooray!
I think it's a... Yeah, they're our friends of the Royal Naval
we like them
Division
because of Gallipoli, don't we?
But go back and listen to our Gallipoli series to hear about the Royal Naval Division. But no, I think it's another successful attack.
And of course, it's not the only one, because around the Somme, the Fourth Army is also attacking. It's just an awful, awful period for the Germans, isn't it? And they order a general retirement back from Cambrai. And amongst them, those retreating, was a young chap called Corporal Frederick Meisel, 371 Infantry Regiment. He actually fought for the Americans. He's in the American Air Force, I believe, in the Second World War. He emigrated. This is what he said then.
Wow.
I'm not going to do a daft accent, because I'm not Gary with his wonderful command of Gay Richthofen, which is how all his German accents sound. He says this: our division passed through Cambrai. British shells had set it on fire. The air was acrid with black smoke, the heat intense. Our pace increased as the danger from falling timbers became evident. Scurrying down the endless streets, Otto tried to light a cigarette. Anyone got a match? Pointed to a smouldering telegraph pole. Paul replied, "There, help yourself." Eyes and throats were beginning to burn, lips becoming parched with the heat. Just as I thought we were doomed to be burned alive, the outskirts of the town were reached. A short rest was ordered while we filled our lungs with the sweet fresh air. A wind had sprung up, driving away the thick clouds of smoke, showing the burning city clearly, the flames lighting the landscape. And it's an awful... You've got to remember, they're not evil baddies, the Germans. You've got to have a human feeling for their suffering as well. I know they're the enemy of our countries then, but they're not our enemies now, and I feel quite sorry for them.
Well, I think it poses the question too, Pete. You know, we've got this incredible imbalance where the Allies are smashing the Germans every day. The Germans are in full-on retreat, falling back all over the place. And why did they keep fighting? Like, even from a political, the top-level perspective, why did they keep fighting? And the answer is, of course, they knew that every inch of ground that they held would slightly give them an advantage in any peace negotiations that were coming up. The more ground they held, the more cards they had to play in the negotiations they knew would be coming up. Didn't work too well for them in the end, but that's the reason they kept holding on to every piece of ground, every village that they could.
And one interesting thing is, as they break through, as the Allies break through, they get through to what you might call clean country, an area that hasn't been fought over, where you've got fields, vegetation, towns still with the local civilians, and the trouble was, it's still a war zone, and there were some terrible scenes where civilians, French and Belgian civilians, are caught up in the fighting. And you've got a quote from Major Joseph Rice, Sea Battery, 82nd Brigade, Royal Field Artillery.
Here's what he said. I shall never forget the march through Bertry and Troisville. The former was populated by old men, women and children. The men lifted their caps to us as they had been made to do to the Boche. There were one or two of our cavalrymen lying dead in the streets, and we also passed a number of them and their horses before reaching Bertry. All the civilians waved or cheered or cried, and lots of houses had a French flag flying. The inhabitants must have hidden those flags for 4 years. The same sort of thing happened in Troisville, but while we were marching through, a Boche shell crashed through the wall of a house just in front of us, and as we passed, an old man came out wringing his hands, which were covered in blood, and 2 soldiers carried out a girl who was apparently badly hit, but we could not see whether she was dead or not. It was a terribly sad sight. It's just remarkable, isn't it, Pete? Because, as you said, we're a new country here where there hasn't been fighting before, and in the former frontline area, the civilians had all been evacuated, so they weren't fighting areas where there were civilians. But now, all of a sudden, the battle has now caught these villages that are still populated. And
people have been terribly
just horrific. That probably in the early days of the war we had these issues, but also in the late days of the war as well, as the fighting really breaks
and
out.
Most of
it's really awful.
For the British and French and the Belgians and the Americans, a lot of it's advanced to contact, particularly in the British areas. And advanced to contact is one of the most dangerous things you can do, because the clue's in the word. You advance, then suddenly something happens, and you're in the open. And this is,
as I said in my Gallipoli book, it basically means, you men there, go and walk into that ambush.
Yes. And this is what there's a couple of quotes we've got here from where the 5th Connaught Rangers were ambushed, sort of ambushed, but hit by a sudden outburst of fire. In this case, artillery fire. And this is Captain Charles Brett, and he said, "I will never forget the look of horror on the face of one of my men as a splinter of shell disemboweled him in the seconds or moments before he died. Another one had his legs almost amputated just at his knee, and I with my penknife severed the few scraps of flesh and sinew which held it together before tying him up and sending him back on a stretcher. And that's just, you're walking along and suddenly shells crash down on you, and wow. And there's another quote. Who are you going to be?
I'm going to be Second Lieutenant Alan McPeak from the 5th Connaught Rangers, and he actually has an interesting perspective on pretty much the same thing. It sounded as if express trains were crashing through space and blowing the roadway into a ceaseless fountain of dust, smoke, and blazing light. The leading platoon was almost destroyed by one of these shells, and the dead bodies came rolling down the high banks at the side of the road.
Now,
and I just have to say again, Pete, this is not what we expect from the closing days of 1918. I mean, we don't know anything. I think most of us don't know anything about it. And the other thing that I think is interesting here is we're hearing about advances through towns that I've certainly never heard of. And the reason is because the front line has advanced so far. The towns that were in the front line for 3 years, we know inside and out because we were fighting over the same ground time and time again. But here, I'm mispronouncing town names all over the place because I've never heard of any of them. It's quite remarkable.
Just like working with Gary.
How dare you, sir? How dare you?
Now, so the infantry on the ground, and right at the top, the supreme commander of the Allied forces, Foch, he's issuing on. He's giving directives to keep on attacking, keep on pressing forwards. He wants to maintain a unified pressure on the Germans. And Haig sums this up, and he says this. Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, commanding the BEF. The enemy has not the means nor the willpower to launch an attack strong enough to affect even our frontline troops. We have got the enemy down. In fact, he is a beaten army, and my plan is to go on hitting him as hard as we possibly can till he begs for mercy. And Haig and Foch are working hand in hand on this. I mean, Foch is in charge, but Haig is his loyal lieutenant, pressing onwards, forwards, and of course Monash was doing the same for Haig while he was there in September. So
there's a real feeling amongst the Allied generals they can smell blood, isn't it? That they're just going and going and going, and they realise after 4 years that this is it. This is our chance to actually smash them, and they're just not relenting. And that's fine. That's a fantastic strategy. But at the end of the day, for the blokes on the ground, it meant day after day after day of just murderous advance.
Absolutely. A battle follows battle. I mean, the Battle of the Selle. Who's ever heard of that? Oh, yes, historians have, but not many other people. That's mid-October. It's a huge attack towards Le Cateau from earlier on in the war, pushing across the Selle River. And you've got a quote from Second Lieutenant Clifford Carter, 2nd York and Lancers. And
that's a new one.
Hey, Langers.
you just offended half of the north of England, but we'll skip over that. He said the guns put up a perfect barrage, a real wall of fire just ahead. It was too near to be pleasant, and we had to lie flat with our faces in the grass. After a few minutes, the barrage advanced 100 yards, and we were just preparing to follow it when a great shout went up from behind, and 3 tanks came lumbering out of the wood. We dashed after them, seeing nothing but fog, and not knowing when we should come across the enemy. But the guns had done their work, and only a few Germans popped up here and there out of shell holes and dugouts. If they seemed prepared to put up a fight, our fellows gave them 3 rounds rapid. Most of them just put up their hands and surrendered, crying, "Kamerad!" We soon collected a score or so, and after depriving them of bayonets, knives, and so forth, I sent them marching off with an NCO and 2 men. Suddenly ahead I saw a German officer preparing to fire with his pistol. I quickly aimed at him, and he as quickly put up one hand, still holding his pistol in the other. We shouted to him to drop it, and seeing he had no chance, he did so. I pinched his field glasses and iron-pointed stick, and still prize them as mementos of the occasion.
Nothing but a bit of looting from the prisoners. Always.
I don't know why he didn't grab his pistol. That would have been the memento to have. But, geez, that is a lucky German. They gave him every chance to survive, didn't they? I've seen plenty of other accounts where they just shoot them out of hand. So
I'm glad
that German didn't realise his luck.
I bet he's dead now, though. Or the oldest man in the world. So the British, they're attacking again, and but there's a lot of problems started to build up, and I think we ought to just slow down a bit, like they have to slow down. And the reason is logistics. And you and I both know that you can plan things on paper, but if you haven't planned your logistics out properly, you just, I mean, just the guns, the shells needed for the guns, but there's also the food for the men, there's the ordinary munitions for the men, the railheads are further and further behind. There's no railways across no man's land. That's amazing, isn't it, Matt? No railways across no man's land. There's not many roads, It's all the delays caused by logistics put a pressure on the Allied commanders, because they know that every single day the delay gives the Germans more time to reorganise their troops, improve their defences. But they've got no option.
And we should reiterate a point that we made in one of the early episodes as well, is that armies need roads and railways to move. Men can sort of walk cross country, but it's tiring. Horses, can get cross-country, but there weren't that many horses out there. But artillery guns, trucks carrying food and supplies, wagons, all of that stuff has to go mostly on roads. And so when you're trying to cross no man's land and the whole area is devastated, you're not going to go anywhere until the engineers can repair some roads. They lay down corduroy log tracks to try and get some way forward. You're not going to be able to move the guns if there's no roads. You can't move them across a battlefield.
Logistics it's a serious business, isn't it? Now, we ought to mention that people often think that British divisions are in the line all the time. The Australians were for a while, but that was Monash. But they are rotated, and I've got to do the next accent because your New Zealand accent is appalling. It just sounds Australian. So I'm going to be Second Lieutenant Reginald Richards of the 2nd New Zealand Rifle Brigade. And I'm going to do him in an English accent because I believe him to have been a Scot, just to add further confusion.
Good Lord.
He says this, you must not imagine every company was engaged in front every time the division made a move forward. Brigades took it in turns, or battalions took it in turns, so it was only at intervals that we had to push out in front. We leapfrogged alternatively, pronunciation with Pete, with the 42nd Division. The attack of a division was something like a series of waves breaking on the shore, one battalion after another pushing on, and the whole sweep up the beach, gradually losing its momentum. And that's a great analogy, I think. A very intelligent New Zealander, that.
There's many of them. And it's interesting, isn't it? We were talking about the Australians being out of the line, but the Kiwis are in it right up until the end. And some of the most celebrated Kiwi battlefields of the war are actually in this area, way in the east, way out of the Somme and sort of the northeast of that area. Where the New Zealanders did some fantastic work late in the war. The number one being Le Quinois, as it's pronounced, but spelled Le Quesnoy, which, incidentally, a new New Zealand museum has just opened there, Pete, and I haven't been to it yet, but I'm looking forward to going there.
Me neither, and nor could I pronounce that name you just said.
Le Quinois. But a nod to the Kiwis. We should never forget our New Zealand Anzac comrades. So while the Australians were resting it up behind the line, the New Zealanders were still in the thick of it.
I think we ought to. The other thing is, I want to pay tribute to the Americans as well, because they are getting ready for a huge offensive in the Meuse-Argonne that's going to be launched on the 1st of November. Now, we've talked about they'd had such a tough time. They'd had a long, hard autumn. But they finally got clear of the Argonne Forest. They got through the big German defence lines. They've now got the Meuse River, which sort of bastard river, sort of comes across their front. So first it's on their right, but then it goes diagonally across them. But there's no let up. They just push on. Foch is pushing Pershing, General John Pershing, and he's a hard man. He's determined to push forward, press home the advantage. No time for hesitation. On. They must seize the moment, no matter what the cost. On. And you're going to be the intellectual genius that is General John Pershing of the American...
Yeah, neither of us are huge fans of the old Pershing, but he certainly got the job done. Now that Germany and the Central Powers are losing, they are begging for an armistice. Their request is an acknowledgement of weakness and clearly means that the Allies are winning the war. That is the best of our reasons for our pushing the war more vigorously at this moment. We must strike harder than ever. Our strong blows are telling, and continuous pressure by us has compelled the enemy to meet us, enabling our allies to gain on other parts of the line. There can be no conclusion to this war until Germany is brought to her knees.
Tough man he was. And just to put it in context, the first American army, we talked about how huge it was. Well, a second one has arrived now. It's not ready to go into action yet, but it's there. Can you imagine the Germans going, oh, God, there's two of them? It's just ridiculous.
And we're talking millions of men, aren't we? We are literally talking millions of men. As we said 2 weeks ago in our four attacks in 4 days, the Meuse-Argonne was the biggest battle Americans have ever participated in. They put 1.2 million men into that action. It's just extraordinary. Not the biggest battle of the First World War, the biggest battle they ever participated in any war. It's just extraordinary.
And this is what Major General William Wright, he was commanding 89th Division. It's what he said about the upcoming battle on the 1st of November. He said this: "We can expect bitter fighting, many machine guns. To overcome this, we must have full development of fire action, great development in depth, and resolute determination to go forward at all costs. The more we hesitate, the greater will be our losses. The halts on our objectives are taken according to the best previous experience in order for the infantry to be coordinated with the barrage. All other halts should be avoided. Troops must drive on and leave strong points to be mopped up by the support detachments. This mopping up must not be neglected, however. Special detachments are detailed for it, but the assault element should pass on and gain the main objective. Don't forget your communications. Send back reports of how you're getting along. Then we can help you. Then we can keep the attack going. If your phone doesn't work, try the buzzer. Remember, you'll have pigeons and runners. Infantry must never be advanced in the open without a tremendous fire of machine guns or artillery. You must organise for this. Move your supporting machine guns when your infantry is halted. Then move the infantry forward under their fire. Machine gun officers must study the terrain and study the maps of the forward areas in great detail, deciding where they can best sight their guns to accomplish this mission." And what do you think? When you hear that and compare it with just a month or two before, what do you think about the way the Americans have progressed?
They've learnt very quickly, haven't they? I mean, he's exactly right, everything he's saying. Don't advance in the open without machine gun fire. Don't neglect to mop up. That was something we spoke about when the Americans first went into the line. Geez, they learnt quick, Pete. They learned as much as we did, we being the British and the French. That took us years to learn, and they did it in a matter of months, but really quite extraordinary. I mean, they had good teachers, didn't they? They had us showing them how to do it.
That's us, yes.
But gee, they picked it up quickly. The Americans were a hell of a fighting force by these closing days of 1918.
Now, you can be as keen as you like as a general, but the actual ordinary doughboys, that was their nickname, as you know, doughboys, they're not always quite as enthusiastic about on as some of the commanders were. And there's rumours of peace spreading, and the men just chat amongst themselves. And there's a lovely quote that you're going to read by Private Horace Baker of the 3rd 128th Regiment. The numbers give a bit of a clue. 32nd Division. And I just love this next quote. It sums it up. Give us it in your best American accent.
I said, fellows, I don't know. I won't do an American accent. No, I said, fellows, I don't want to go back. He's from Brooklyn. He's a hairdresser from Brooklyn, apparently, judging by that accent. I'll start again in my Australian accent. I said, fellows, I don't want to go back to the lines again, for next week is going to be the last week of the war, and I don't want to get killed that late in the game. One of the fellows said, yes, if a man had been over here 3 years ago, or even one, and had got killed, it would have been a mercy, for he would have been saved all this suffering, but now it's different. Ben Holzer added, you are right, I wouldn't mind having been killed away back then, but it would be terrible to get killed in the last week of the war, and if I were to get knocked off on the last day, why, I'd never get over it. This raised a laugh, of course.
I love that quote. And Van Holzer was killed in the last week of the war.
Really? Oh, that's terrible.
It's
what you always say, though, isn't it, again, Pete? You know, the humour of the men. Hey, you laugh or cry. You know, good title for a book.
Well,
how would you get through it without having a laugh every now and again? And it was that sort of mateship, or what the Australians would call mateship, you know, that camaraderie, the closeness of men in life-threatening situations that got them through it.
When it comes to weight loss, no two people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie. She's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't outtrain her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. Even through the pickiness, Noom taught me that building better habits builds a healthier lifestyle. I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Hey, it's Mark Maron from WTF here to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. And I'm sure the reason you're listening to this podcast right now is because you chose it. Well, choose Progressive's Name Your Price tool, and you could find insurance options that fit your budget, so you can pick the best one for your situation. Who doesn't like choice? Try it at Progressive.com. And now, some legal info. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Now, there's this last huge battle, 1st November, lies ahead of them, and that's going to last to the end of the war. And when the barrage roars out, this is Colonel Conrad Babcock, headquarters 354th Regiment. Again, the numbers.
The numbers, 354th Regiment.
and each has got
6th.
3 battalions. He says this: I have no adjectives to describe this man-made flying death, the appalling noises of the shells as they swept over us in one continuous flight. In some respects, the machine gun bullets were, to us, the most terrifying. My recollection, that's machine gun bullets fired in support, not at them. My recollection is that the machine guns fired from 3:30 a.m. to 6:30 a.m. Then those assigned to the attacking battalions caught up with their organisations and went forward he described that earlier. The machine gun barrage was terrific. The bullets following one another in thousands of files sounded to me like giant shears cutting a mile-wide sheet of tin. I've never heard giant shears cutting a mile-wide sheet. Never mind. Although these bullets were clearing the trees under which we waited each hour, it really took quite a bit of mental effort to stand up. It was hard to believe these bullets weren't flying right past one's head. For 2 hours we sat or lay down under this torrent of lead, steel and high explosive. Then, at 5:30 on the minute, the infantry whistles blew and the assault battalion went forward behind the rolling barrage. And this machine gun bullet barrage is something the British and the Allies had developed in 1917 and was started to be a really... And basically, they fire it over your heads. That's why you don't want to stick your head up too far, although actually they're hundreds of feet up above you. But it's... and then they land a deluge of bullets behind the German lines, just picking off people who are in the open or even, in communication trenches.
It's a good point, Pete, that we talk about these barrages, and obviously it was absolute hell to be underneath them, but even for the attacking troops, when we're talking about more artillery and more machine guns than have ever used before. I mean, it sums it up perfectly with that quote, that even for the blokes that this barrage of fire is supporting, it was a horrific ordeal.
It's frightening.
Going over your head.
and the barrage itself, the Americans have learned from the British and the French all the techniques they need. They mix a rolling wall of bursting 75mm shells. That's a creeping barrage. The heavy guns, the medium guns, they're firing on pre-identified targets of note, batteries, command posts, redoubts. The machine gun fires hosing all round the German positions. And the trench mortars, not mentioned them before, they're at it all. It's all fun for the Germans, I'll tell you. And you've got a quote from one of them who's facing this blasted onslaught. And this is Lieutenant Otto Lace. And he's in the 3rd 169th Baden Infantry Regiment. What does he have to say about this American hell on earth?
During a pitch-black rainy night, the regiment arrived and began to dig into the open fields and meadows. No sooner had they started to dig when a storm of heavy artillery fire descended upon them. Within 2 hours, over 100 American heavy tanks and countless light tanks emerged to roll over, crush, and wipe out the regiment completely. The majority of the officers are dead or severely wounded. The machine gun crews, the anti-tank crews, and the hand grenade troop of the infantry have all been eliminated after a brave defense. Superiority of force has prevailed. Out of the pale grey mist of dawn came row upon row of grey monsters with the rumbling of motors towards us. The heavy tanks move up to the machine gun nests and the anti-tank guns. The turret gun is lowered. There is a flash of fire and a report. The defenders are swimming in their own blood. Move out! The tank rattles on.
Yeah, I think he over-exaggerates the role played in tanks in this. But funnily enough, having read about these battles,
I don't think it's hundreds and hundreds, row upon row, but it's a lot. And it must have been. I tell you what, I wouldn't face one tank very bravely, Pete, let alone hundreds.
That's his perspective, and I respect his perspective. It's a real American victory. The Germans fall back, retreating across the Meuse River. But there's one incident. It's my favourite again. Corporal Horace Baker, which is part you're playing. He's made an attack, and the section's fallen back, and then an officer stands up and says, "Get back up that hill, Corporal Baker." And then suddenly he comes across a life or death choice, and you're going to go through Corporal Horace Baker, 3rd 128th Regiment, and the thinking process he goes through as he realises he's got to choose.
This is the antidote to all of those stories we hear about men that win themselves a VC by just taking on the German army on their own. This is the antidote to that quote, so that we know that not everyone thought like that. I love this. It's a great quote. He said, "I looked down the hill, straining my eyes through the fog. Somehow there was a blur in the little thicket at the far side of the field. I looked again, and horrors, it was a line of German soldiers, not less than 200 strong, standing or walking about. It will be difficult to tell my emotions then. I will say that my hair stood on end as it does when I see a snake. I raised my rifle and took deliberate aim. Thinks I can get one now, and know I got him. But just as I was ready to pull the trigger, I thought of something else. I can get 2 at least before they can tell where I am. So I aimed again, but failed to shoot again, for a pesky thought almost knocked me down. It was, what if I do kill 2 or a half dozen, and they swarm over the field and kill me? How much will that profit me? So I decided to let them live." Is that the definition of discretion is the better part of valor?
I think
he could have killed 1, he could have killed 2, he decided he could have killed a half dozen, then he thought, nope, because they'd kill me.
I'll get out of it. I'm getting on out of it.
So he killed none.
I think let's turn back to the thing that's at the centre of my interest at this point. I have to say it's the British Army, and they're fighting the Battle of the Sambre, which begins on the 4th of November 1918. Now, at this point, you've said it, Matt, that the war's decided, but the actual timetable of when Germany's going to give up is still a bit. You can't quite see what's happening. When are they going to give up? The German allies have collapsed. The Turks are out. The Austrians are out. But that's not. This is the idea. People say, "Oh, if you beat the Austrians, if you beat the Turks, Germany will fall out of the war." Well, they're out of the war, and Germany's still fighting on because that's the centre of the central power.
Wait, Pete. Are you saying after all these years that Gallipoli probably wasn't a great idea from the start?
I am saying that, and Salonika and Palestine and all the rest of them.
The rest of them.
What it is what's winning the war is Foch's relentless series of attacks up and down the Western Front. Here. We did this with the punch-up scenario. One to the ankles, the jaw, the stomach, and then the groin. And they're going to win, but when? What about? So could anybody rescue them? What about the Navy? What are they up to? German Navy?
Well, the Navy was having its own dramas, wasn't it? I mean, it's, again, slightly overlooked, but a fascinating story about how, the German Navy at the end of the war was ordered to head out and have one desperate mission against the high seas fleet and to take on, the Grand Fleet, which has been reinforced by the Americans. So basically send out every German ship you've got and watch them all get sunk in no short order. So unsurprisingly, the Navy was a little bit resistive to this suicide mission.
Well, they mutinied, don't they? It's a sort of
one by one, the ships decided they were not going to go and sacrifice themselves, so they didn't go.
I think that's very sensible, and they don't go. The ships are mutinying. They send troops to restore order. They join the mutineers, Matt. You can't blame them. And by 5th of November, the whole of the Kiel area is in the hands of revolutionaries. And then 3rd of November, Austria-Hungary signs an armistice. Germany's all on its own. And the German Supreme Commander's got no choice but to accept any conditions to secure an armistice. That's the situation. So does the fighting stop? Does it stop? Does it stop then? I
don't think it does. I don't think it does.
No, it doesn't. It goes on and on. But there's one... As they're planning for the Battle of the Sambre on the 4th of November, the British have one advantage. They're not facing Somme 1916-style defence works. They're not facing things like the Hindenburg Line. They're just facing improvised defence work. So it's more likely to be behind a wall or a ditch at the end of a forest, that kind of thing. There's no masses of barbed wire. There's no reinforced concrete pillboxes, no deep dugouts. So it's just the landscape. It's improvised defence systems. Villages are fort. They quickly made a cellar into a little bit of a fort, but it's not the same. What are the British doing to modify their tactics, would you say?
Yeah, the British are having to adjust to this new way of fighting as well, and some of them took a little bit of time to come up to speed, because we're not talking about trenches now, we're not talking about these heavy German defensive positions like we had before. We're talking about open warfare where infantry is going to be exposed and they need support in quite a different way. And I think some of the commanders actually struggled to come to terms with this sort of new way of doing things, and they couldn't envisage ordering in advance without seeing a huge barrage in front of it at first. But that wasn't necessarily the way forward.
They've also begun to run out of tanks. We discussed this earlier, and way back in August they'd started running out. There just aren't that many tanks and tank crews because they're not a one-use weapon, but they're almost a one-use weapon. You use them and then they're buggered, but essentially...
Well, what we're seeing here, Pete, interestingly, isn't it, is that the Allies have invented this all-arms strategy, these tactics which will end the war, but even they are starting to struggle with it now. It can only go on for so long. They couldn't have kept pressing this for a year or 2 years. Even the Allies were starting to struggle now, and it was getting really difficult to keep pressuring the Germans in this way.
But the great thing is that they did struggle through, and I quite like some of the... you're dead right. Some of the commanders really struggle, but some of them don't. And this is Brigadier Hanway Cumming, great name, headquarters 110th Brigade. And he shows quite a bit of flexibility. He says this: the chief lesson learnt during these times was in the cooperation of the field artillery with the infantry. In long advances, the infantry very soon get beyond the support of heavy artillery and depend entirely on the lighter arm for support. Undoubtedly, the field artillery, long accustomed as they had been to the system of barrages, so essential in an attack on a limited objective, was somewhat at sea when rather sticky when confronted with the problem of supporting infantry in the open. They very quickly adapted themselves to the changed conditions. Indirect fire could still have been employed where necessary, and fire brought to bear over open sites when opportunity offered. Some portion of the guns in advance of this kind should be far enough forward to be able to take advantage of opportunities, which may be fleeting ones, for energetically supporting the infantry. And he means that they've actually not all in one battery, all together in one position. They send some of the guns forward, almost just behind the infantry. It's more risky. They might get ambushed. They might get hit.
It's almost Napoleonic, isn't it, Pete? In some ways, it's what we saw at Waterloo. The guns, up right behind the infantry, firing directly on targets they can see.
And it does work. Now, look, the Battle of the Somme. Are you picturing a small scale engagement here, Matt?
No, I'm not. Massive. We talk about, we've talked about previous battles where an army was participating, and here we've got, it's 3 British armies, isn't it, participating, plus the Americans, plus the French.
Right. It's everybody. Everybody's attacking. It's just amazing. And you've got a quote from my namesake, Brigadier General Herbert Hart, who's commanding 3rd New Zealand Rifle Brigade. What does he say?
Well, he sums it up perfectly, doesn't he, with this quote? The fighting spirit of the enemy is broken. The only obstacles in the way of a complete breakthrough to the Rhine are communications, supplies, and weather.
Yeah. And he's
that would have been a breakthrough if he's talking about breaking through to the Rhine.
Well, I think they could have done it, but for logistics. It's logistics. The German armies, I'm going to use a technical term that we often use, buggered. For instance, the German Second Army, let's just take an example. Only 3 of its divisions were fit for combat, fully fit. 7 were just about capable of it, but not very good. 5 thought in need of immediate relief, taking out the line, and 4 were described as not operational. That's a serious business. 17th Army, same thing. The other Germans counterattacking like they used to. They take a German position in 14, 15, 16, 17, even early 18. And what happens? You know what happens.
They counterattack, but
Yeah.
by 1918, the shine has worn off the counterattack somewhat, and you can see why. You know, the British didn't want to go out and get killed when they knew the war was almost over. The poor old Germans were on the receiving end of it. They knew it was coming up, so they did not counterattack with the same passion as they had in previous
Come
years.
October, November, they're not really that interested. There might, but there were still some German units. You asked Jack Sheldon, the historian of the German army in the war years, and some of them were still competent. They'll launch localized counterattacks, but they're often just disruptive. They're not really aiming to hurl the British or Americans or French back. We're back to logistics again. It's just awful. By November, it's stopped being problematic and become a brick wall to progress. They cannot get across the damaged area. They're running out. The lorries are getting they're just breaking down. They've used them too much. Horse transport's too slow and can't get it. The Germans are booby trapping and culvert mines. The houses are pulled down across what's left of the roads. It's just totally a disaster. So how is the Battle of the Somme when it begins on the 4th of November? How does it go?
Well, it's a great victory for the British, but geez, it was a tough fight to get there. So they really earned that victory, the British and the French. It was just a grind as opposed to what we'd seen earlier in this offensive, which was sort of sweeping over the Germans. This was, as you described, grinding to just try and get that victory, and they did in the end.
Well, it works, and I always think, and this is a quote I've picked to show this. You can have a victorious battle, but for you as an individual fighting in it, it can be a tragedy because you lose your best mate or you lose mates who you fought with, sometimes for years. And this is a quote. It's an oral history quote from Private Harry Bashford, 7th Beds and Hearts, fine buddy of mine. And he says this. This is the 4th of November. A white tape had been laid well in advance of our front-line positions, and at the appointed time we crawled out and waited for our barrage to open up. When it did, all hell was let loose. Our instruction was always to keep as close as possible to the creeping barrage. It was like walking behind a wall of fire. What effect it had on the enemy you could only guess, but it was the nearest I ever came to losing my nerve. Under these conditions, there's bound to be some confusion. I got mixed up with another section, and later saw some of my platoon evidently caught by machine gun fire lying in a little semicircle. The gun that had caught them was about 100 yards away, and slumped over it, the gunner, with his face cut clean away. Not a pretty sight, and one not easily forgotten. It was here in our last engagement that one of our men suffered a stomach wound from which he had no chance of recovery. From the first days of the war until the last, men will die, and to those concerned an equal misfortune, and yet there must be more sympathy for those who so nearly finish the course but fall at the last fence. As far as we were concerned, the war was now over. And these casualties, I mean, it seems, of course, if you're killed on the on the 22nd or 23rd of August 1914, it is just as sad as if you're killed logically on the 11th of 4th of November 1918. But somehow it seems worse. You've fought all that, you've suffered like that bloke the American said, Banhofer. I'd rather have been killed earlier. I'll be really pissed off if I'm killed on the last day of the war. But somebody important was, well, not important, but somebody symbolically was killed that day that impacts a lot on the poetry reading brethren amongst us, who I respect. Wilfred Owen. Why is that important?
He's one of my favourites, actually, but it's interesting that his very late death has certainly contributed to the legend of that poetry.
Yeah, he was killed on that day. He was fighting with the 2nd Manchesters, trying to lead his men across the Sambre-Oise Canal. It's insignificant as a loss in the battle. There's lots more losses, but because of his reputation as a war poet, it resonates, doesn't it? And you you love the poems, and so does so many people. And that again,
he was always a bit of a sad sack, wasn't he? So it seemed it's not fitting, but it seemed ironically appropriate that he should meet his death so close to the end of the war, because he talked about enough in the lead-up.
He did. Poor old sod. So, despite heavy casualties, 1st Army, 3rd Army, I'm going through the armies here because we ought to pay a roll call. 3rd Army, 4th Army, they're all British. The French 1st Army, they all make great progress. That doesn't mean there's hold-ups. It doesn't mean there's not loads of people dying and wounded, but they overcome the obstacles. The Herman 2 line, which is almost non-existent, as I mentioned earlier, was breached. And next day, 5th of November, the advance continues. And it becomes more like a pursuit, doesn't it, really, at this stage? Would you say?
Yeah, the whole thing is falling apart. The Germans basically now order a full-scale retreat. These aren't fighting withdrawals anymore. These aren't hold the line while we bring up other men. This is a full-scale retreat of the Germans, falling back to what they referred to as their Antwerp-Meuse line. But again, these things are really only creative, colourful crayon marks on a map. The Germans have not had time to construct any sort of defensive position this far behind the fighting area.
And let's make it clear, they didn't have the time to construct it because Foch and Haig and Pershing and Petain didn't give them the time. I mean, that's part of.
And I was making a joke when I said the map, but basically what we're talking about is they're saying fall back to this spot. That looks like a good spot on a map to make our next stand. So that's what they're falling back to. Well, retreating back to by this stage.
Now, there's still nasty little skirmishes. There are determined German rear guards, and if you bump into one, if you have the bad luck to bump into one, it's bad. It could be very bad. And I want to make it clear, the weather is bloody awful. That's not a surprise for early November, but it was awful. And you've got a quote from Captain Joseph McLachlan, 1st Cameronian, Scottish.
I won't do my Scottish accent. It's an interesting quote, isn't it, this one?
Yeah.
You have no idea of what the men have had to endure in discomfort, cold and wet, and general misery. We kicked off on Monday morning, so did the rain, which started as a steady drizzle, then increased to a downpour that lasted intermittently for 3 days and nights. As our fighting equipment includes a sleeveless leather jerkin but no greatcoat, we were all soaked through right at the start. The approaches to the river which we had to cross became a marsh that took us up to the knees in water, so we were distinctly wet. So were the rations, and altogether I thought half of us might die from exposure, but it's wonderful what one can stand. During the 3 days fighting, I had no shelter from weather day or night, except a waterproof sheet, and slept, or tried to, on the ground. On the 1st and 3rd nights at the edge of a wood, and on the 2nd in a muddy hole where we had dug in the middle of a ploughed field. However, we survived it, and came through all right. My food was one of the most ragtime description: wet bread, an intensely filthy cheese, and once or twice a mess tin of tea made over a candle.
Now, I can't help but think of Gary Bain, my podcast partner, when I hear, because he was an ex-soldier, and as he says, soldiers never complain, but they observe a lot. And I have to say, Captain Joseph McLean's observing a lot there.
He's doing a lot of observing.
But it's true. It must have been awful. And then there's people shooting at you every so often. But the one thing, and he has it in mind, we survived it, came through it all right. They know that the war's coming, that it's going to be soon. But right to the very end of the war, people are still dying. And it's so random, isn't it, in those finals? It's not like a massive over-the-top attack. It's often, for the British especially, for the Americans, they're still fighting like buggery. But there's just a shell coming from nowhere to take you out. And you, I don't know, how would you feel? Everyone wants to survive the Great War, don't they?
You just want to feel safe. You want to go back to your old life as you know it, not surrounded by trenches and gas alarms and exploding shells and steel flying through the air to cut you in half. No more requirement to stand to at dawn and dusk and to dodge snipers' bullets, and no one to bury in the dirt anymore. It's almost within reach, isn't it? They can see it right there. We're going to be home soon, and yet they still have to push on. We're a week until the end of the war here, but they still have to push on, and it's horrendous.
And this is Private Edward Williamson, 17th Royal Scots. Everywhere the troops' hearts were filled with a sense of relief and anticipation as the fateful hour drew near. George Waring echoed all our thoughts at breakfast time when he exclaimed, "I'll be sorry for poor devils up and down front who will not live to see it. It's just the look of the draw." He apparently was a northerner who'd been placed in the Royal Scots for no reason.
That was brilliant. I'm joking. That was the best I've ever heard. But,
so when is
yes,
the
he
armistice?
makes a good point. It was just the luck of the draw.
It was, yeah. So come on then. When's the armistice? Come on, you know this.
Well, it was, this is obviously something that people probably do know about this fighting. So, yeah, it's 11 November, so early in the morning, I think about 5 a.m. in the morning, they signed the armistice announcing that the war would end, and decided, I think, really for neatness and for a moment in history, to make it the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. So the fighting would end at 11 a.m., but also to give people time to get the news that the war's over.
And here's a quote from Corporal Charles Hennessy, 2nd 15th London Regiment. What's he? And you've got to sing here. I bet you don't know the tune.
I don't know the tune, but I'll do my best. Well before 11 a.m, our people decided to cease fire, but the Germans, for some Teutonic reason, kept shelling our positions, almost up to 11 a.m. Then the noise stopped everywhere, and there came a silence which hadn't been experienced for 4 long years. We had a tremendous feeling of relief at the thought that we had come through alive and would in due course return to Blighty. At the same time, we felt that it was no time for jubilation, but for sadness at the thought of so many of our comrades who would not be going home. Here's the song, I'll recite it like a poem. When this bloody war is over, oh, how happy I shall be. When I get my civvy clothes on, no more soldiering for me. We never sang the above ditty joyously, because so far as we could see, the war was never going to end. It was sung only on those occasions when, as a small carrying party, for example, we waited at some dreary ration dump to collect rations and take them up the line, or, having drunk more than enough Mont Blanc, we sat in some estaminet feeling doleful. And now, to our great surprise and joy, it was après la guerre.
They can hardly believe it, can they? I mean, that sums it up perfectly. Just,
And when they say there's no jubilation, you always picture they must be jumping up and down for joy and throwing their hats in the air. And I'm sure that was a brief emotion, but it's amazing how often you hear this, that there was just this sort of dull shock that it was all over, and they couldn't believe it.
Yeah, there are many different ways of celebrating, or just almost accepting. It is a strange time, and there have been whole books written about the last day of the war. We ought to make it clear that were the Germans stabbed in the back by the Jews or communists, or had they been beaten on the Western Front?
As we said, stabbed in the front. It was a resounding defeat. They were absolutely smashed, and we should not mince words about it. It was a huge defeat inflicted by the Allies and the German army. And that was why the war ended. That was why the war ended, let's be clear. The war ended because the German army couldn't fight anymore. It was not some political manoeuvring to come back in 20 years and try it all again. The Germans couldn't fight anymore. They were absolutely defeated.
Yeah, and any other things you hear are basically confusion that's been created by, we'll call them German nationalist politicians, to avoid naming them, in the interwar year. And they have their own agenda. They couldn't, They were absolutely routed, and they're beaten not just by Allied superior numbers, they're beaten by greater military resources, they're beaten by the tactical flexibility that Foch, Haig and the rest of them used. Now, this last quote I want to read, what do you think of this last quote? Well, should I read it first and then you give your thoughts about it?
Let's do
it's
that.
An armistice memory. It's Armistice Day, and one young American soldier, he's exploring the battlefield in front of, and that must have been an incredible temptation. Although battlefields are dangerous places, even when they've got munitions all over them. But I found this quote. It shows that horrors of war don't fade rapidly, and some people don't recover quickly. And this is Private Arthur Jensen of the 7th Engineers Train, 5th Division, American Division. He's not a frontline soldier, and he wanted to see. And he goes forward. He says this: I struck out to explore the heights along the Meuse River. Here I found several machine gun nests, lots of dead Germans and a few dead Yanks. In some places the men had been killed by bullets, but in others they were blown to pieces by shells. An arm here with a hand gone, and a leg there with the genitals hanging to it, or a solitary head which seemed to accuse civilization with its silence. In one place I found a stomach lost in the grass, while round the limbs of a nearby tree were the intestines. The whole ridge had a stench so horrible and so repulsive that all the ghastly sights seemed indescribably worse. Another place I found 4 Germans shocked together. He means killed and by the blast. Their stinking flesh had turned green and presented a spectacle so gruesome that I could see, smell and taste them all at once. Sickening as it was, I hadn't seen anything yet. A little further on was an American soldier stamping a dead German's face into a pulp. I suppose the Germans had killed one of his buddies. What do you think of that, man?
It's just, I think that's the point, Pete. I mean, the war's over, but the hatred and the emotions still endure, and it wasn't simply an end point for these men. I mean, you read that quote. I would imagine that bloke never got over that for the rest of his life. I reckon every time he smelt a dead rat or saw something gruesome in the garden, I reckon that those memories would come flooding back. And we're talking about millions of people trying to endure that. And it's a conversation for another podcast, but to talk about the effects on these poor buggers when they went home is just indescribable. I mean, Pete, you had the privilege of speaking to a lot of these men. Did they carry these feelings with them for a long time after the war?
Oh, they did. I mean, people never forgot certain individuals, certain friends who were killed, certain incidents, sometimes things they'd done that they shouldn't perhaps have done, people they'd killed. I've just been reading about, listening to a quote of a bloke who saw two men pop up in the no man's land, so he shot them. Then later on he was taken prisoner. He realised they were stretcher bearers, and he never really recovered from the guilt of that. I won't say his name. But yeah, so there's a lot about war that impacts, and it's not just, people make it as shell shock, post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's not a disorder, it's a natural response to the things they've been through, I think. And it cannot but help affect you. They were a great generation on all sides. They fought hard, and I admire them enormously. I feel very sorry for them.
Yeah, I agree, Pete. Very well said. And I think that sums it up. And as we draw this special series to a close, we've talked a lot about grand strategy. We've talked about changing tactics. We've talked about mechanical instruments that helped win the war. But I think the thing that this has touched on, particularly by those quotes you've put together, mate, is just the human cost of this whole thing. And it's been a hell of a journey. I'm quite speechless after that last quote, mate. It's just it's some horrific stuff. But I'm glad we've shone a light on it. I'm glad we've taken the time to break down this really overlooked chapter of the war. And as I said at the start, I've learnt heaps. And so it's been brilliant, mate. I can't wait for the next one.
Me too. Cheers, Matt.
Thanks, Pete. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast, and visit livinghistoryytv.com for more great history content.
How did you actually sleep last night? If it didn't feel like your very best rest, then you need to upgrade to the softest, most luxurious bedding from Boll & Branch. Their signature sheets are made from the finest 100% organic cotton and get softer with every wash. Millions of sleepers love their sheets, and right now, you can feel the difference for yourself during their biggest sales of the entire year. Hurry to bollandbranch.com to shop their best offers. Limited time only. Exclusions apply. See site for details.